Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kim Ricketts, and I'm here to introduce and welcome Grant McCracken, who is visiting us as part of the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. He's here today to discuss Chief Culture Officer, how to create a living, breathing corporation. In Chief Culture Officer, McCracken says that too many corporations outsource their understanding of culture to trend hunters, cool watchers, marketing experts, consulting firms, and sometimes teenage interns. Levi Strauss, the jeans and apparel maker, missed out on the hip-hop trend. The cost to Levi Strauss was $1 billion. The lesson? The American corporation needs a new professional. It needs a chief culture officer. Grant argues that the CCO would keep a finger on the pulse of contemporary cultural trends, from sneakers to slow food to preppies, while developing a systemic understanding of the deep waves of culture in America and the world. The CCO's professionalism would allow the corporation to see coming changes even when they only exist in the weakest of signals. Grant McCracken is a research affiliate at C3 at MIT. He earned his PhD in anthropology at the University of Chicago and was the founding director of the Institute of Contemporary Culture. He has taught at Cambridge, McGill University, and Harvard Business School, and consults with an array of companies including Campbell's Soup, Coke, L'Oreal, I'll get that right, IBM, and the Children's Television Workshop. He has written 9 academic books, and his work has been covered by Oprah, the New York Times, the LA Times, Newsweek, and Business Week, among others. So please join me in welcoming Grant McCracken to Microsoft to discuss Chief Culture Officer.
Thank you, Kim, for that kind introduction. Listen, I'm happiest in a classroom that's collaborative and interactive. My favorite teaching was at the Harvard Business School, where it's, those of you who have done case studies will know it's really very interactive. So you sing out with questions. I won't be able to field all of them in real time. We may have to postpone some of the answers, but please could we make this something less than, if we know anything about contemporary culture, we know that that old asymmetry that has the expert talking and the audience listening and something like a deferential attitude, that's just shattered forever, right? So it's collaborative, and I hope we'll make it interactive. Okie doke. I wanted to start with, or it just occurred to me now that I should start with a photograph that I got taken this morning. I did a radio show in Seattle, and the other people participating were women who are professional roller derby athletes. So we all got a photo, and it's fantastic. They're all doing these kind of martial kinds of poses and these terrifying looks on their faces. And I sent it to my wife, whose only response was, "Come home soon." So what I want to do is talk about, I'm trained as an anthropologist. Our stock in trade is this thing called culture. It's slippery and difficult to talk about, but as I hope you'll agree, we may already think so. But if you don't think so now, I hope you'll think so by the time we're done. And I'm going to move at pace because I've got a lot to cover. So let me know if things are unclear, and we'll here's my proposition: that culture is a thing that we can study in a formal, systematic way, as you know, all the things that come to us from our academic professional training are, and that the corporation has been systematically bad at treating culture as if it were a thing that admits of this systematic professional study. Culture remains a kind of mystery. This is bad news. Oh, just to be clear, when I talk about, when Google actually has a chief culture officer, when they use that term, they mean, by culture, they mean the corporate culture, the culture inside of Google. That's not the culture I'm talking about here. I'm interested in that kind of culture, but the one that really, the point of the book is to talk about how we can understand culture outside the corporation. And by culture, I mean, this is where it gets a bit slippery, especially with people with, you know, who are the masters of really rigorous arts. Look at this and go, oh, dude, this is a little too vague for me, but that's just what we have to live with. Culture is, if you will, the software in our heads, the set of meanings and rules with which we create language and nonverbal behavior and all of the ways in which we interact with the social world. Those are constrained by rules. There's a English anthropologist called Kate Fox, who decided that she'd try to figure out what the rules of English life were, what the culture of England is, looking at the rules of social life. And what she did was go to public places and cut into queues. And she said you could see, English people famously constrained in public spaces. She said you could see the smoke coming out of their ears as they watch somebody jam in the line. Because the English are good at many things, and queuing is one of them. That superb sense of how you negotiate this quite complicated business of getting everyone in a line to take their turn when that turn comes. This thing called culture, it's hard to talk about. But one of the reasons it's hard to talk about is that we kind of extracted it from the proposition. Adam Smith, the fantastically gifted Scottish economist, father of our notion of economics, that was really part of his genius, was to say, let's look at human behavior, especially as it takes place in marketplaces. What we're going to do is extract out anything that's cultural and social. What we'll have left is interested parties pursuing their self-interest through the exchange of value in the marketplace. What we are trying to do here is put back the cultural and the social in this equation, because as we'll see, the outcomes of those marketplace relationships often turn on that social and cultural stuff. So here's my argument. This is just sort of, feels to me like the last order of business. Corporation is extremely good at a lot of things. It just isn't very good at culture. There are many core competences, and my argument here is that culture should be one of these. That we need somebody in the C-suite, senior manager, whose job this is to keep track of culture. So does culture really matter, and is the corporation really so bad at it? I want to just run through a few examples here with which to make the case, and I think with these kind of case studies, as it were, tiny little examples they are really, you'll get a clear sense of what I mean by culture. Levi Strauss missed hip-hop, the hip-hop trend. They had a very good marketing rationale for what they were doing. Their notion was you could come into a Levi Strauss store and they would measure you perfectly so every pair of jeans would be the best fitting pair of jeans you ever had. In the meantime, culture changed. Specifically in this case, hip-hop came up and they lost $1 billion in sale. Somebody on the marketing team plaintively said, well, who knew baggy pants were a paradigm shift? To which the answer is, that's actually your job. It's just strange to think that something so critical to the success of a company that depends upon a knowledge of consumer taste and preferences should have escaped them. Quaker bought Snapple for $1.7 billion. What they didn't know was that Snapple had come up, really got going. Remember 1991? Remember especially here, Seattle in 1991, when that alternative movement that had been circulating, I'm just going to use that for lack of a better term, it was circulating in college radio from about 88, or think of the Pixies and finally in 91 the thing just goes wide, and people are really, really not interested in the traditional soft drinks like Coke and Pepsi, and they find this quirky little brand called Snapple at mom and pop stores at the corner, and they embrace it. It runs up in value extraordinarily. By 96, the alternative thing is dead and dying, and the value, its value as the value of Snapple as a brand that captures some of this social, cultural movement is diminishing. Quaker finds this out when they're obliged to sell it a few years later for $330 million. Mergers and acquisitions is a great place for me to kind of make this argument because the metrics are so nice and clear. The punishment, the penalty for not getting culture is so clear. Best Buy bought Musicland in 2001, just in the teeth of peer-to-peer sharing, and had to give it away 3 years later. The CEO of Best Buy said, if just talked to the kids who worked in my store, I would have understood. I mean, if all we had done was tap what every kid working in a Best Buy already knew, we could have avoided this taking a bath to the order of $700 million. So PepsiCo, so I tend to hyperventilate when I'm speaking for some reason, so I occasionally have to make this sound like a whale to just somehow equilibrate, forgive me. So PepsiCo embarked upon a redesign of all the big brands. ΓÇöa, the new CEO, could see sales diminishing. She said, let's revitalize the brand. And they brought in this designer called Arnell, who took this package and turned it into this package. Disastrous consequences. Consumers actually rose up in a fury. Sales dropped in a hurry. PepsiCo had to restore the old brand. And the problem here was that Arnell was actually not thinking about consumers or about culture. He was thinking, as designers sometimes do, about what was cool. So his mission, as it had been given him by Nui, was to make the brand, to rejuvenate, re-engineer, rethink, and re-participate in popular culture. Music to my ears. That's what brands should do. What he did was go on a 5-week tour of trendy design houses. This is not the best place to put your finger on the pulse of American culture. Not the worst place by any means. Designers really know culture fantastically well. They just have no real breadth here. And this is a point may or may not come out in what follows, and just let me emphasize it here. Too often, and these examples might mislead you, culture isn't just about cool hunting. It's not just about the latest thing. I figure those fads and fashions and trends, they're probably maybe 10% of what we call culture, 20% tops. The rest is something more, it changes certainly, but it changes almost at a glacial pace. And that's what we're talking about here when we talk about culture. Anyhow, the point I want to make here is Arnell confuses culture and cool. His notion is if I just did the latest, if I satisfied what the design community cares about, American culture will take care of itself. And my argument here is one of the reasons we need a CCO is that gurus and cool hunters are unreliable. When Business Week said to Arnell, how badly do you feel about screwing up these brands? He said, well, not really. He said, what the hell? I got paid my money, I've moved on. It's the picture of unrepentance. A fantastic loss of share value and brand value, and he just doesn't care. So another reason for a CCO is to have somebody who has an enduring commitment to the corporation. So we're looking here in each case at a blindside hit that the corporation doesn't see happening. If it had had a CCO, it would have seen each of these blindside hits happening. Now I want to look at the other side. So that's just, if you don't know culture, you're subject to these blindside hits. Now I want to talk about the advantage of knowing culture is because you see opportunities out there that you can turn to advantage. Any thoughts before we press on to this second section? Sir.
Yeah, you're talking about this from the anthropological standpoint.
I am.
But it also occurs to me that the people in semiotics are also spotting.
Totally.
And that they'll spot the trend. They may not know what it means.
Right.
But they'll spot the signs.
Yeah.
So you kind of need both.
Yeah. I would argue, and this may be a kind of imperialism on the part of my part of the social sciences, but I would argue, you hire the anthropologist, you get the semiotician. The reverse is not true. But again, that's probably a parochial view. Oh, well, I guess I should justify that decision. I mean, the anthropologist is looking at, the semiotician is interested in symbol systems, right? Signs, that is to say. And the anthropologist is interested in those symbol systems, but then interested in all of the cultural meanings that are the foundations from which those symbol systems sometimes come, but don't always come. I mean, there are cultural foundations that never find a kind of explicit or code-like expression. And so the anthropologist will get you that. And the semiotician will miss it. Though semioticians, I'm sure, are better than the limits of the theory. Sir?
Traditional organization, the product planner or the product manager, or at the higher level, the chief marketing officer, doesn't this role of understanding the culture lie under them, or how are you advocating a separate?
Yeah. In a perfect world, this would be the CMO's domain. I guess the trouble is CMOs are working fantastically hard at a range, often just the tactical, their tactical responsibilities are such that the strategic things, I think somebody actually at HBR did a study that looked at senior managers and discovered that they were doing like 2 hours of strategic planning and thinking a week or something. So as it is, those people are maxed out. And this stuff is so complicated and so difficult. It really is a substantial kind of body of knowledge. I think you need somebody who is, yeah. Please.
Okay. Have you seen any evidence of somebody seeing this forward-looking and preventing disaster? 'Cause
Yeah.
It seems like something you can armchair quarterback.
Totally. Yeah, and you cherry pick like crazy, right? You just go through the business literature and choose the things that serve. Well, we're going to talk about a few of them now, people who have spotted things coming. But that's a more scientific test is, okay, give me the 411 on this particular corporation. And I'm confident I wrote the book in 3 months because I had just that window in which to work. And I really had that anxiety, like, did you just cherry pick the best examples? So in my blog, I kind of every week or so, I try to find another case in point, and I apply the argument and I see, does it work, or am I smoothing and faking? And I think it actually works. I think it's more robust than I thought it was going to be, which, is a big relief after you've signed your name to the manuscript. Good to see the argument seems to work. But see what you think of these examples, please.
So I'm struggling a little bit to think about this in the context of how we do business on a global scale.
Right.
And how we define culture globally.
Great question.
Rather than, because we tend to kind of just look for the lowest common denominator.
Yeah.
For building our products.
As does everybody.
Customers, right?
Totally.
So I'd love to hear you talk about that as you go through some of your examples.
It feels like this is where that glocal concept comes in, where you're global on the one hand and very local on the other. And it looks like this is the signature for many of us on the planet now, is that we have those two loyalties. And what's falling out, this is just a fascinating kind of topic all on its own, and maybe we'll get to it, but it's a kind of, people are calling this the Death Valley construction. And the classic expression of this death is the notion of big brands are flourishing and niche brands are flourishing, and the brands in the middle are dying. But you could use it actually to talk about global citizenship. So people identify here globally and then locally, and that may mean their neighborhood or their town. And what's falling out for some people is the national identification. I'm Canadian by birth, and Canadians are very global and they're very local, and Canada, they care about being Canadian, but actually these two things in a way are so anyhow, that's the trick, isn't it? Okay, let's just press on. So these are some of the people who are naturally occurring CCOs, as it were. And you recognize some of them. We're going to talk about a few of them. They're prototypical CCOs. They work in an official capacity. They're good at creating and managing cultural meanings. And this is the upside of culture. This is when culture becomes not a source of blindside hits, but of opportunities. And one of my favorite examples here is a guy called Jeffrey Frost, who is, he's an agency guy. He was a Yale undergraduate. He learned Japanese. I haven't been able to piece together all of the details here, but he joins Motorola when it's getting hijacked on either side. It's losing to the Finns on the one side, the Finnish on the one side, and to the Koreans on the other side. And Motorola I bet everybody in this room, at a certain age, owned that Motorola. I think it was called the clamshell or something. It was I remember giving up a year and a half of service to get my mitts on this Motorola phone. It was just the phone of the moment. By the time Frost joins Motorola, those days are long gone, and it's in a kind of free fall, hemorrhaging. It lost $6.5 billion in 01. He discovers the trouble with Motorola is that it practices what Frost called death by committee. Good ideas come out of the lab, and then people all get together in committee and stick it with a knife. And before long, even the best, most robust ideas never make it out of committee into the world. So he sees this idea, which eventually became the razor, and he goes, oh, this is good. My first order of business, and this is where knowing the culture out there and the culture inside is important. He says, if I leave this corporation to its own devices, kill this idea. So he kind of smuggles it through the process. He gets it out into the world. The results are fantastic. By the end of 06, he sold 50 million units. Motorola is back on Easy Street. Xander is taking all the credit. And then the story turns sad. Frost dies in 05, And by 2008, 3 years later, the company is back in free fall again. It's as if somebody has reached into the corporation and ripped out its navigational equipment. For want of this guy who's acting like a CCO, Motorola goes into free fall once more.
What was his formal role?
He's one of those guys who floated, but I think he was like an SVP of, honestly, I don't know. It's like innovation or, one of those titles that, sir.
Yeah, what's interesting about what you're saying is the CCO dies and the culture dies. Do you see a heavy attachment between the individual that represents the culture?
Yeah.
I mean, the typical example, I think, is Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
Steve Jobs,
Yeah.
the day he's gone,
Totally.
everything goes.
It's done. They have.
Do you find the same thing with the CCO, or are they successful when they actually, the organization lifts the culture beyond that?
Yeah. Here's the hope that, I've had a colleague at HBS, Deshpande, Rohit Deshpande, who said, listen, marketing is too important to be left to the marketers. Everybody in the corporation should know what it is and know how to do it. And I think that's got to be true of this culture thing as well. And in point, I would go, not just for the reasons that Rohit was suggesting, I think there's what we can say is, there's so much waterfront, so much of culture to keep track of. If there's somebody in the corporation who really knows about professional bowling or roller derby or gardening or pot throwing, or they should make that knowledge available to the corporation. In a perfect world, we would ask them to make that knowledge available to the corporation. So in a perfect world, everybody would be in on the game. And when they were watching TV at night, I mean, somebody's going to be can make themselves expert, if they're not already expert, in kind of primetime comedies, and can see something shifting in 2.5 Men as it's overtaken by the Big Bang Theory, right? Yeah. You think about those two kinds of, 2.5 Men is a very clear innovation in the world of comedy. You look at Big Bang Theory and you go, whoa, something is happening here. If you've got an expert, unofficial expert, it would be great to have that knowledge on tap. And it means that if your CCO is coming and going, you still have this kind of ground, you have this kind of, the culture of the corporation is still connected to the culture outside the corporation. This is Silvia Lagnado, a Brazilian Canadian, who noticed that that most women didn't think they were beautiful by the standards of the beauty industry. And she said, well, but surely this is an opportunity, out of which came the Dove campaign for real beauty. Yeah, I don't know do you use the language blue ocean opportunity here at Microsoft, right? This is a fantastic blue ocean opportunity. It had been sitting there for 40 or 50 years, right? This had been true for a very long time. Marketing executives looked at it and went, well, we don't care about that. We're the beauty industry. We insist on standards of beauty, and it doesn't matter if consumers don't buy those standards. So along comes Sylvia, and you have a different approach. And that's just somebody, I mean, all she's doing there, it's not really culturally very sophisticated. She's just believing what, the research tells her. She's going with the consequences of what the research tells her. Chris Albrecht, this is an amazing story. When this guy came to home box office, it was making showing boxing matches that most people didn't want to watch, and movies they'd seen before. I mean, it was just a struggling little operation. Within a very short order, it had transformed, within 10 years, it had transformed TV, and its high moment is the Emmy Awards of 2004, when it just takes everything going. And in the process, this guy taps what's going on in culture and manages actually to change the culture in the process, right? We think of Sex and the City didn't just sell a lot of fantastically expensive shoes. It actually changed the way some women thought about who they were, especially in the city, who they were as sexual creatures in the city. So some fantastic kind of cultural reckoning and shaping going on in this case. Here's the weird thing, right? So where I get this data is from the business press. So I'm trying to reverse engineer what I see in the business press. So anytime I see somebody who's good at culture, I say, well, how did they do it? And try to figure out their system. Bonnie Hammer of USA Networks has a system. She's the reason that Comcast just spent a fortune for NBC. Nobody cares about NBC. What they wanted to get was was USA Networks. And the reason they wanted USA Networks is they wanted Bonnie Hammer. So But this guy, when they asked him, so how'd you do this? How did you transform TV? His answer was, well, we just take bigger risks. Oh, dude. I mean, that's the art of management is not taking bigger risks. It's making intelligent risks, right? In a perfect world, you gather enough intelligence, enough strategy, and enough tactics, and it's not risky. But this guy had so little sense of how he was doing this magic that that was his answer. It was really very odd. He's also a tragic character, now kind of removed from, but that's for another time. A.G. Lafley. Yeah, sorry.
Don't be a CCO, right?
What?
Don't be a CCO.
Yeah, right. No, that wasn't what happened to this guy. Anyhow, it's a story you can't tell at all unless you tell in quite a detailed way, so I'm going to spare you. We'll come back to it if you're interested. A.G. Lafley is, I make part of my living as an ethnographer. When A.G. Lafley said ethnography, when he sort of blessed it as the method after focus groups for the corporation, it was like a papal blessing. My phone just started to ring. It was just suddenly this guy put it on the map. And several years later, this is what he said about the revolution he had brought to P&G. He says the trouble with P&G is that when it makes a product, it focuses on the most narrow function. If we're making toothpaste, we think about the brush in the mouth of the consumer in those 5 minutes in the evening and the morning that they're brushing their teeth. What we need to do, this isn't his metaphor, it's my metaphor, his notion is let's dolly back. Let's go from, imagine the camera on the hand holding the brush, dolly back to the full person, dolly back to the moment in which this is taking place, dolly back to the family in which this is taking place, the household in which it's taking place, the community, and finally the culture. So here's a guy going from very narrow and functional to a much broader view. And in the process, I mean, the great thing about this guy is, he makes it pay. It's not just well-wishing or a kind of wishful thinking. But this is just a great story. Chris Hughes was one of the 3 guys who founded Facebook. A member of Friendster that came and went in 5 years. It went from total obscurity to big profile to total obscurity again. It was there. It should still exist. We could never quite get a handle on what this thing called social media was. The reason Facebook came up and claimed this moment is that this guy, Chris Hughes, knew what Facebook was for. He knew that we would use it not just to reach out and make connections with existing people, but with new people, that we would use it to build these ever larger, the anthropological literature says that 125 people is the number that we can sustain by dint of conventional efforts. We now look at people with social networks that are vastly larger than that, 500, 600, 2,000. His notion was, well, the reason these networks are now technically possible, the technology makes it possible for people to reach out and make contact. But these systems are hydraulic. They're exactly like mushrooms after a spring rain. Unless they're constantly fed with tiny bits of content, they wither and die. So it's easy to build a network of 2,000 people, but it's nothing. It does not create value for yourself unless you're constantly feeding it with things. And Chris Hughes said, let's make photos one of the things that people feed their networks, sustain their networks with. And if we need proof of our interest in this aspect of social media, we need only observe that 24 million photographs a day are placed on Facebook. I do some work for IBM, and occasionally the CEO will make grand statements about how much IBM loves Facebook. But of course he does. The amount of hardware needed to sustain, to capture, to store 24 million photos captured every day is phenomenal. Anyhow, so this guy has a feeling for culture. He's good at spotting how something creates value. And then he leaves Facebook to go to work for Obama, and the Obama team say, great, you do this, whatever this thing is called social media, that's fine, good. Go get us money. And he says, well, nah, don't ask me to use new media for old media purposes. There's a bigger opportunity here. He says, look, you can use, well, we know this, right? You can use these networks to create, to gather intelligence. Now you can have your Obama rep listening to every village in America, you've got somebody in place thinking, well, what do people care about? What does Obama need to know if he wishes to be the President of the United States? Now, once that intelligence comes back to you, you can refashion your political message, and then you can send it back into the community. Each of these people can deliver it in real time, crafting it for the community as that community changes. And, it is the beginning. Until we completely disintermediate politics, and just as a personal note, when are we going to start talking about this? And this was the year we saw education get disintermediated. This is the year we saw newspapers get disintermediated. Education can't be far off, but when politics? And I'm a great admirer of President Obama, but once you're going to start talking about using the technologies that are now American Idol can canvass, hundreds of millions of Americans, maybe not quite that many, but it's typically 76 million votes. Maybe it's just 10 teenagers voting often. But you know what I mean, right? The possibility here is here, and with real control and some intelligence, we could be voting every 15 minutes. So when's that going to happen? I don't hear anybody even talking about it, which I think is just weird. Anyhow, so there's Hughes kind of spotting that kind of first step toward completely disintermediated politics. So what these people have in common is a deep knowledge of what needs to happen inside the corporation, and then a deep knowledge of what's happening in culture and what's possible, what's irresistible, and what's next. So now this is a little bit, this last section is all about Microsoft. And hey, I'm no expert. And you are experts, so I realize that I'm kind of, taking I'm putting myself in harm's way. But that's my job. Okay, we could use lots of examples here to talk about corporations that have created value out of culture. And the examples would be the Four Seasons, Starbucks. When Starbucks talks about that third space, part work, part home, how they combine the two, the Venn diagram that brings those two, a space that's both public but kind of private, that's open but also intimate. That's a cultural engineering that's going on there, right? Our culture, and only our culture, thank you very much, insisted that those were mutually exclusive domains. And Schultz says, well, with some smart design and some good training, the right retail formula, we can bring those two domains together. We can create a third space in this culture. It's pretty interesting. But that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about Microsoft. It seems to me this campaign, which you must just loathe. I know the feeling, I've seen it so often, I'm beginning to loathe it myself. But this is a classic bit of cultural engineering, to the extent that it takes an existing distinction in our culture, I don't know if this has got between mainstream and the avant-garde, and it maps onto that cultural distinction, this distinction between the brands, Apple and Microsoft. In other words, Apple is taking advantage of a cultural structure, a cultural architecture. And it seems to me with the work that Boguski has recently done for you, well, I'm sure you're working in collaboration with Boguski, you managed to tunnel out. It's a lovely piece of work. So here's kind of what it looks like. Western culture has always had this notion of a mainstream. For all of the diversity that's always existed in Western cultures, there's been something like a consensus in place, governed by elites, and you get people signing on, and it's a certain amount of noise in the system, but there's a general consensus about what this culture cares about, how people think about themselves and how they think about the world. And then you add, and sometimes around the 1850s, you'll see it in the book. I try to nail this down, and I haven't done a perfect job, but I think roughly speaking this is right. Around 1850, you get this kind of systematic invention of a thing called the avant-garde. It happens in Paris. It's artists systematically defining themselves in contradistinction to bourgeois society in Paris. And this thing, in the book, check it out and see if I got this right. But it looks to me like these 5,000 artists in Paris around 1850 designed this posture, this alternative posture, and it's the ultimate meme. It's the ultimate virus. It starts to recruit like crazy until you get 100 years later, in the 1950s, you've got beat poets who are playing out the same alternative vision, but now, like, I grew up as a kid in Vancouver, BC, up the road here, and totally obscure, totally kind of middle-class, bland Canadian upbringing, and I knew about the beat poets. What those artists invented 100 years before was now kind of generally distributed, and our culture now had this kind of tension between the old mainstream and the present avant-garde. Sorry, I have to take a breath. Sometime around the 1880s, and this is really fun to see anthropologically. This is one of my big bets as an anthropologist. I wrote a book called Plenitude. Everyone said, I mean, the jeers, you should have hit the jeer. My argument was our culture is fragmenting. We've got this dynamism, this kind of invention has been let loose, and the elites are falling. The whole thing is kind of generating in an interesting kind of way. And I'm pleased to say everybody now agrees with me. But when I produced this book 20 years ago, I was pilloried for it. So anyhow, we now know there's a third circle here where people are disobeying the mainstream, but it's not because they're insisting upon making the statement of themselves as being hip or cool or alternative or holier than thou. That whole avant-garde notion comes right out of Paris in the 1850s. Was we may be poor, we may live on the margin of things, but we have a kind of cultural capital. We have a kind of social standing that makes us way more important, way better, more sophisticated, more desirable than those poor schmoes who live in bourgeois splendor in the suburbs. We're better than that. That alternative message isn't happening here. These people are just saying, no, we're not mainstream, but we're not posturing here. We're not insisting on our coolness. We're just different. So here's how it plays out. Apple says, look, we're going to map the brands against this distinction between mainstream and avant-garde. And then Boguski, you guys and Boguski get together and think, how do we do this? And the notion is, let's occupy this third space with the I Am PC campaign, which I think is just a brilliant piece. I mean, you were the captives of Apple's branding strategy and its use of some aspect of our culture, and you tunneled out brilliantly. I mean, just brilliantly. Now, this does brilliant things in your struggle with Apple. Instead of looking like that guy from, the IMPC, the Apple PC distinction, instead of this guy, he's always dressed like a hipster vaguely, and he's always dealing with this clueless, this guy. Now Apple suddenly looks self-conscious. It looks like it's trying too hard. It looks like it's so hip it hurts. Tragically hip is the phrase used in Canada. Compared to little Kylie, remember she's probably Korean American, the little girl who's editing a photograph on her. Apple now just looks like a dope by comparison. So it's fantastically good work, because that Apple's work there had been devastating to the brand, and this is a nice way of getting out. So the value of CCO then is someone who knows the standing architecture of the culture, knows that we divide the world into mainstream and avant-garde, sees the third domain install itself, and seizes on this as an opportunity to fight the Apple positioning. So just summing up now, I would ask you to consider the possibility that we treat culture as a core competence. This is a time, I think, to take culture more seriously, to map it, to mine it, to spot the blindside hits, to look for the opportunities, to have the CCO acting as a navigational officer. And I just want to make a last note, because I know people in this room are really good at one of the things I'm not good at. And please, this is just a kind of personal appeal. It'll be very quick. I need cultural metrics. A CCO is going to need cultural metrics, and they don't exist right now because of this, the inclination to make culture a thing of the humanities, and anthropology is not famously statistical. I've got an HBS student is now running, he owns music catalogs, and we were talking, and he said, at any time ASCAP can give me the figures for what music was played this morning in the United States, broken down by region, by radio station, region, and the radio stations are very carefully kind of positioned, right, to take advantage of certain demographics. So that data, you know, just at the very least, if what we had was a baseline, and then noticed the data tell us that country and Western music is up in the Northeast, that'd be really interesting. As a cultural indicator that something was happening, it'd be like, maybe some work I did for Coke was, Coke sponsored a torch run in Tokyo, and people came out and wept as they watched this torch run go by, and Coke said, what did we do? I mean, they do this with all the Olympics, and you know, people like it, they don't like it, but this was an extraordinary reaction. They sent a team of us in to find out. So this is the kind of thing, you get this baseline, you get the data, you send people in to find out what's going on. We can, you know, people are trying to scrape Amazon and YouTube for this kind of data, but we can get way better at it. I just want to end with this wonderful example. And this is kids at MIT rigged Cambridge with cameras that were sensitive only to color. And so what you can use these cameras to tell you, to identify, this is Cambridge, and this is color clothing color in Cambridge. And believe me, nobody cares about how people are dressing in Cambridge. I mean, least of all the kids living in Cambridge. But imagine if you had this map for some fashion-sensitive neighborhood in Paris or London or Tokyo. Imagine if you had a map for each of those, and you could watch. You could say, okay, the fashion shows happen in Paris, and then you could watch all these neighborhoods and see where the colors took. Just this idea of streaming data. So if any of you are interested in kind of working on a project like that, I would love to hear about it. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. Please let's chat, and thoughts and comments, please give me a shout. Thank you. Sir.
A lot of your presentation was focused on foreign corporations and how they should adopt a new CCO role.
Yeah.
What is your recommendation for smaller startups or medium-sized companies?
Yeah. I think, you know, Moore's book, Leaping the Chasm, that notion that the early adopters of any technology are people who are themselves very good at technology that probably have some knowledge of. And so you give them a new technology and they figure out how to use it. Where the chasm comes is when you want to start speaking to people who don't have that inclination or that knowledge. Now you have to craft it for somebody who's clueless. It seems to me that's where you really need a CCO. And if you think about Facebook as a startup in its early days, and you see what Chris Hughes is doing, he's really looking at how people are going to want to use the technology. Then he says, oh, this is the kinds of differences this will make to people's lives. And then let's build this in. So that rapid iteration, I think that would be a case in point. But I think it's, you know, I have a friend of mine at MIT who says, you know, you should be talking to people who are coming out of startups that stalled, not for want of money necessarily, but because they couldn't find that place in the market that really works. Those are the people who might be interested in the book. Sir.
I can't help but think there might be a little bit of an innovator's dilemma built in. Mm-hmm. Especially the Levi's example and the baggy jeans. Like, I have a hard time believing none of their product managers or marketers saw the trend at all.
Yeah.
They were probably just in denial about it, believed that their way was better.
Yeah.
And they had something to protect. They had a sort of installed base to protect.
Totally.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, totally. I think that had to be the case with Tropicana. You know, everybody looks at that second packages and just goes, what were you thinking? I mean, everybody knows that's bad design. And so I suspect a lot of people didn't want to do it. And that's the thing. There was so much pressure coming from on high that only a senior manager, only a CCO could throw himself on the tracks on that one. Everybody else was going to be just, Nui wants this. Massimo was her second in command, wants this. So they just do what they do. So that would be another, I think, rationale for somebody who's prepared to, a heavy hitter, prepared to come.
Be a pretty senior person to have a fighting chance, is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. Sir.
How do you really operationalize this, right?
No, I know. It's like, you know, the first generation of CCOs, if there is a first generation, they're going to be like engineers who have to invent the math while they're doing the engineering. I mean, it's not, and that's why I want some of the cultural metrics, because I think that'll make life, there's so much waterfront to cover. The churn, the dynamism is so intense that anything we can do to create those instruments would be useful. But it's not going to be easy. One of the things I think we won't want to have happen. I mean, a lot of people who are doing MBAs also did a first degree at a business school, and my sense is that's wrong. Liberal arts is a good place to start. Engineering is a great place to start. But this 2 MBA thing, the 2 business degrees, is probably not a good idea. So I have no real answer, and that's a problem. I gave something like this presentation at the Stanford B School. One of the kids did the symbol of hurry up, like we get the argument, now how do we do this? And I had to say, well, we'll have to see how it works.
Well, it seems like it's kind of at odds with the current methodology that you used to. You study the market, plan a product, or any of those things, right? It's almost like it's another layer that you layer on top of multiple processes that happen today.
Yeah, totally.
Right, and you almost have to engineer it into each of the. It's a new thing.
Yeah, totally. And I'm hoping if people really have do their foundational work, and they have a deep and intimate knowledge of American culture, they can deliver in real time, ad hoc on an ad hoc basis. So they can look at it, they can step into a project that's happening and saying, if it's not a very bad idea, in which case they have to throw themselves on the tracks, they can say tinker here, tinker there, fit kind of thing. Yeah. Please.
And also a related question. It also feels like in some of the examples that you use that more of a right brain, intuitive approach play a role in making some of those decisions. So having that foundational methodology, but also allowing people just to use their intuition in a pretty impactful way. Like I'm sure when you saw the razor, that was an intuitive reaction that you had to that design.
Yeah. The problem here, this stuff often gets looked at as kind of soft side as opposed to hard side decision making. The problem is that there's so many factors you need to control. This is why historians are actually not very good as historians until they're in their 40s, because they have to learn so many facts before they can have this sense of pattern recognition where they can go, oh, they've got all factors in mind. And then the truth, or some conclusion, comes to them as if bubbling up from the unconscious. But in fact, that's a systematic kind of, and almost a hard process, right, of keeping track of many factors and figuring out how they work in relation one to the other.
Can you engineer it though, or is it something that just happens organically? Like
I think
the
you can.
HBO guy, like he just did that. I mean, his own explanation of it was an organic one, right?
Yeah, totally.
Even if it was a systematic approach, it wasn't anything that he consciously.
Yes, I think you can get. I mean, the really inspired people will always be head and shoulders above the rest of us, but I think the rest of us can get way better at the smartest thing anybody said. In the HBS I knew was, he said something so brilliant, it was like a holographic image formed above our heads. It was just perfect. And I looked him up in the system, I thought, this is going to be a kid with a degree from Princeton or something, and he was an engineer who had come out of the British military. Just like no humanities training whatsoever. Just very smart, very clear, fantastic. He's a commando actually, so he's all about improv, kind of like what do we do in this, how do we read this situation as it forms, and what do we do now? So I think all that stuff is yes.
So how do you see this connecting? I know at the beginning you said this is about, American culture and outside of the culture.
Right.
But the reality is every generation has its own cultures and everything. I, would envision the chief culture officer being able to balance that and reconcile those and whatnot, and then also being able to create a culture inside in which you can respond to the culture outside and drive that. But so how do you see that relationship happening between, or balancing, or integrating the outside culture work going on with inside corporate culture and changes that you're trying to drive or whatnot?
No, it's not going to be easy. And one of the things I sort of labor to talk about in the book, and I haven't had a chance to talk about it here, but I think this notion of CCO will have to be a person of absolute humility. This I've seen this happen. I don't know if you see it happening here, but I used to see it happening at Coca-Cola Company. You would come into the boardroom a tiny bit late, and you could tell exactly who the agency, not the agency that's unfair, but the gurus in the room would always be dressed in Prada head to toe and have fantastically cool glasses, and the rest of the meeting would consist of them telling senior managers at Coca-Cola Company, very smart people, thank you very much, sort of browbeating them for not knowing what the kids were doing, not knowing what an ollie was in the skateboard culture. And it was just like, oh, this can't be, I mean, and bless them, these senior managers would go, okay, good, ollie, the check. But there was some sense that they had been embarrassed for not knowing about culture, and I guess that's my hope here, is that we'll see all of that go away. But we have to take a step further, and sorry, I am getting to an answer. The person who is a CCO in the C-suite is not only not going to be able to be Mr. Smarty or Ms. Smarty Pants, he or she is going to have to be an extraordinarily humble person who just puts him or herself at the disposal of everybody in the C-suite. So, HR should have a keen interest in the culture of American culture. So it's that kind of devotion to everyone's enterprise in addition to one's own. And then this question of how, and again, there's this opportunity to making the corporate culture a fountain of knowledge about contemporary culture. So that's one way of getting engagement and building that loop, inside, outside, outside, inside, living, breathing kind of corporation notion. And then this global notion of, like, you're not just talking about American culture, you're talking about a global culture as American culture shapes and is shaped by that. So it's a very, it's a complicated thing. And it'll take, somebody's going to have the powers of an air traffic controller in Chicago's O'Hare, right? Just being able to keep track of all this stuff will be fantastically interesting. But yeah, I'm hoping it's possible. I'm hoping I haven't created like a misery for someone. That's my great fear. I think, sir, let me just, please.
I have a question about the metrics.
Yeah.
So, can you give another example? I didn't totally get it, because you started off with a mystery.
Yeah.
Culture is a mystery. Yeah. Now, I understand, how you might be able to look at patterns, but the measurable part is what makes me confused.
Yeah. The notion is this kind of standing notion. This wonderful Harvard anthropologist called Moni Adams goes into this Indonesian village, and she looks at the pattern, she looks at the way villages are designed, and she says, holy cow, if you think about it, you sort of blink your eyes and you stand back a little bit, that's the structure of thought in this Indonesian community. And that's the notion, is that for anthropologists, you can't ever see culture straight up, right? You can't ever see the ideas in somebody's head. All you can see are the manifestations. Some of those come to you in the course of an ethnographic interview, just quiz you long enough and carefully enough, and I begin to see what you think and you feel and how you conceptualize your world. But another way, kind of wisdom of crowds way, is to see what happens when, the cruise example here would be a bestseller list, is crudely a measure of what people care about, to the extent that we imagine the publishing industry is good enough actually to speak to every interest out there of any size, and then it's a kind of voting system. People buy books or they don't buy books, and the topics we care about most rise to the top, and now we have a measure. That's really all I'm talking about here, is any unobtrusive measure that gives us a sense of what's going on in people's heads and their hearts, and what happens to them collectively as they all decide they're interested in American Idol.
It's a great example when you see looking back, as in after the fact you measure things, but before the fact, when you look into the future, totally. What are you measuring?
You're getting at these basic. Here's the thing that just occurred to me a couple of days ago. I was looking at, somebody was talking about the TV shows, the primetime TV shows that had won on Tuesday evening, and the ones that had lost. And I thought, okay, what are the ones that have lost have in common with one another? What are the ones that have won have in common with one another? And you could say, holy cow, maybe the alternative impulse of our culture, so strong in the 1990s, maybe its last gasp. Because all the losers looked like they came from a 90s sensibility. All the winners looked like they actually expressed a kind of post-90s, non-ironic, non-alternative kind of sensibility. And I thought, so it's that kind of thing. And then you do your ethnography, and please.
So my question is, for a COO, is it just intuition that you...
I think it's intuition based on years of study and then these great metrics, or these great opportunities to see that, oh, the country and western music is up in the Northeast. It's the last thing you expect. It's anytime your expectations are violated and you go, wait, that can't be happening. Now you know this is a culture under construction, as it always is. I'm just, sorry. You know. I'm just, yeah, no, I know. Sure, totally. Sir.
So you seem to be talking about external culture as being pretty distinct from the corporate culture, or maybe not dissimilar, but at least there's a distinction between both of them.
Right.
I don't know what thoughts you have around the corporate culture actually being a reflection, pretty reflective of the external culture, or being like a subset of it.
Yeah.
Something that comes to mind was like Malcolm Gladwell in The Tipping Point argues that culture is really controlled by a set of people called connectors, who pretty much own or run the show in certain demographics. Right?
Yeah.
So while I was reading that, I was thinking to myself, why do you have to hire that guy who has to figure out what the coolest boots are to wear, or actually who wears the boots and everybody else follows him? Why do you have to find one guy who figures out who the connectors are?
Right.
Why don't you actually hire a bunch of connectors to work for you?
Yeah.
And they are not only the influencers of culture, but they are also pretty reflective of the culture that there is.
Yeah.
So I don't know what your thoughts are around that. Can you
is
corporate culture necessarily, does it have to be distinct from outside culture, or can it just be a subset of it?
Yeah. I just did something for Harvard Business Review blog on the Ford Fiesta campaign. They have a car coming out next year, and they use this really interesting approach to social media. What's interesting about this, I think, from a marketing point of view, is they said that Malcolm Gladwell's model is dying. And that was the notion that, incredibly powerful over the last 5 years, and maybe after Malcolm's book, right? I mean, whatever that date is forward, this kind of virus, well, I guess the guy at NYU also makes this argument, but this notion that it's a virus and that all you need to do is colonize the early adopters and they'll do the work of dissemination, of diffusion, right? They'll get the message out, and other people, because they admire them, will follow them, and then you get a few, you get the lot. His notion for the Ford Fiesta campaign, there's a guy called Bud Cadell who works for Undercurrent, who worked for Ford. And his notion was, no, these are not the people we want to talk to. We want to talk to the people who create the best and most interesting cultural content and engage them as co-creators of the brand. And they don't have to be especially influential. They just have to be especially creative. Anyhow, I'll send you the reference. If you give me your card, I'll send you the reference. So it feels like there's some shift in that Gladwellian proposition. There's some, it's certainly right for some purposes. But what it assumes is that you can get there from here, and if what Granovetter which is to say, these people, these networks are really wired in just this way, and that we really do imitate our betters, our diffusion betters, right? We see what they do and we go, oh yeah, I want an Infinity automobile. Those propositions may be dubious, and the more fragmented our culture gets, the less certain it is. So you can get to early adopters, but they have a relatively small radius. And I think Granovetter's argument, from which Gladwell drew some of his argument, would argue that in fact we're more disparate, we're less connected than we used to be, and so you can't get many from a few necessarily.
So it wouldn't be a focus of, say, the HR department of a company to say we have to make sure we target people who have some.
Oh, you're arguing like hire them for internal purposes and then use them for external purposes. Sorry, I missed that. That's brilliant. No, it's a great idea. And then it's going to be, I was just reading about Zappos, and everybody's talking about how fun it is to work at Zappos, and when you come in, they all sing, and I was thinking, oh dear, I don't want to work in a corporation where I have to sing the praises of, there's a kind of that forced fun thing that you get going on in some companies. I don't think it's, and you certainly couldn't do it if what you'd done was bring somebody in because they really knew some aspect of culture. I'm not sure you can ever, I think that's what you want to have, and you don't want to make them kind of a champion of the corporate culture, because that's less interesting than what they know from outside. It's a great idea, though. Please.
I noticed that all of your examples were consumer-facing.
Yeah.
Do you suggest that this would be as relevant for non-consumer-facing companies like a Northrop Grumman?
Like a B2B kind of thing. Yeah, I would hope so. I would hope so, and it comes from, I just did something for a scientific supply company in Boston, and they used to make filters. Now, suppliers offshore make those same filters, so their notion is, oops, we have to make filters plus some intellectual value.
Like what Johnson Controls has done over the past several years.
Is that right? I don't know that story. That's interesting. But
making seats to designing interiors.
Exactly. And as you climb that hierarchy of value, you have to know more and more about the culture, because it's no longer just about the utilitarian property of how good, how tiny are the portions between the strands in the filter kind of thing. So yeah, I would argue if that's where American companies are going to be forced to go, because there are offshore competitors who just undercut them by price extraordinarily, it feels like, and it is the American advantage I think Americans are good at. Well, I'd be careful about saying this because I think South Asia is an interesting place because I get the sense of South Asian friends in Toronto are quick to point out that they get a South Asian culture and they get a North American culture. So I'm interested to see India kind of establish a claim here that will test the American claim to being, as Richard Florida would say, you know, the cultural creatives who really get the cultural stuff and can really create value at that level. I think India will give us, the Americans, a run for our money. Yeah. Please.
You made a brief comment about American Idol voting and being surprised that people aren't looking at it and taking it further. Could you explain further what you're looking for there?
Yeah. It just feels to me like democracy in its Athenian origins, right? It's face-to-face, it's voice-to-voice. Literally, people were counting. And with the new technologies, it should be possible to canvass. Now, listen, I totally understand American Idol is, for certain purposes, the very worst kind of thing, right? Because people are gaming the system like crazy. But I'm assuming that's what great engineering is for, is to figuring out how to create a system that can't be gamed.
I disagree strongly. It's not an engineer. We know how to do the engineering. There are reasons for not doing it, aside from the engineering.
Really? Great. I'd love to hear about those. It just feels to me like it should be, the expression political will should be more transparent than it is. And why do we have people in Washington who are subject to every kind of influence beyond the will of the voice of the people? Feels to me like we could get better. If we disintermediated that process, Washington would be more reflective of.
In some ways, but there are advantages to representative democracy. Living in a state where we have voter initiatives,
right?
We see here very clearly the pain of voting on every little thing.
Yeah.
And there's a real reason for secret ballot voting, and we have no practical way of doing that.
Fair enough. Good argument. Thanks. Sir.
I was thinking about the photo of the fashion colors throughout campus, and it was kind of muddy in some ways. I mean, there was pockets of color and everything, and I was thinking about the churn and the fragmentation that you're mentioning, and I wonder about the longevity of this role, in the sense that all fashions, it seems like, are in bounds now. You can see people wearing 70s, 80s, 90s, probably 20s, the whole thing. And it makes me wonder, is the real acronym not so much CCO, but CVO, Chief Values Officer? And my question is, what is the relationship between culture and values, and how would this role actually leverage that? Because that's the meat of how we define, I think, the different global differences.
Totally. From the anthropological orthodoxy here is value is contained within cultures, and values are explicit, consciously held expressions of preference that say, this is what a family should look like, whatever it looks like. Whereas, so it's just a subset of the larger piece, which is culture, which contains many things, ideas we have about the world we don't know we have about the world. So culture there is operating invisibly within us to organize our perception and our response to the world, but it's not, unlike a value, something that we can see ourselves using. And so much of culture then, because it's invisible, doesn't admit of our change, except in a kind of collective, kind of dynamic, kind of unconscious kind of way. Whereas values are, people can and do have violent debates about what family values are, for instance. So that would be, so only to know about values would be like only knowing about signs. There's a big piece of culture that you still want to have control of, I think. Sure. You bet. Sir.
I'm going to do an A-B question first. First question, with regards to culture and trends, do you see cultures evolving quicker based on Facebook and our online world? Second question, we haven't talked about vision. And what I keep hearing you say is be a really good, fast, ultra-fast follower. So help me blend between, because you're identifying trends.
Right.
So to me, that's fast following. So tell me how to get to leading and applying vision. But first, I'd like to know how do you see trends in terms of cultures changing? Are they changing faster, or are they changing at the same pace? We just kind of project that they're happening faster.
Yeah, it's an interesting problem. Well, here's a good example of how structural properties of our culture are changing under the pressure of change. When I did an exhibit about Toronto teenagers in 1990 in Canada, we were looking at kids. When I was a teenager growing up in Vancouver, I was asked as a teenager, to subscribe to a culture different from my parents, and I had 2 or 3 choices. And once I made that change, the notion was this was a lifelong kind of change. I would be whatever I was for the I actually got recruited to be part of a gang in Vancouver, believe it or not. The notion was I would belong to that group forever. When we were doing the study in 1990, it was clear that that what had happened in the interim was that kids now had many many groups were open to them as definitional envelopes or possibilities for them as teenagers, and they could kind of mix and match. They could belong to several or 2, and they could move back and forth between them. And when we did the study in 1990, we were beginning to see the pattern that is now in place, which is the notion of groups is kind of dying altogether, and kids are developing this kind of modular identity, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, maybe some aesthetic kind of, for some purposes they might have a goth moment, for other purposes they might have a skater moment, but those are not they're no longer cultures or trends of any substantial kind. And it's much more like a smorgasbord, a little of this, a little of that, moving back and forth, cultivating this kind of complicated portfolio of selves. So that's, now we're liquefying, right? We're going from the old model of, here's a group, you have to choose whether you belong to it or not, and once you choose, you're locked in. Now we're going to, well, there really aren't groups, they're motifs for the self that you can adopt or not adopt. Am I getting to...
But I hear you say, so our culture is changing, but I'm thinking like if I'm Levi Strauss, right?
Yeah.
And today it's about baggy jeans, tomorrow it's about straight, skinny leg jeans. And, so are these things happening faster than they used to be? The trend lasted 3 years, now it's 6 months?
Yeah.
Is it speeding up?
Yeah. So one way to think about this is to look at Madonna as an innovator, right? She came along at a time. In the old days, it used to be if you were lucky enough to get a hit act, you would remain that persona, you would remain that band until you ended up playing in Las Vegas for the rest of your life, right? You'd have to play your bestseller over and over and over again. So Madonna comes along and says, well, this isn't very interesting. And she changes, every year or every 6 months, what she's doing is picking up innovations she sees taking place in the street, and she becomes those for a brief time, but she's only there for I did a book called Transformations a couple of years ago in which I contrast Madonna with, who's that, the woman, who? Lady Gaga? No, I'm coming to her actually, but who's the brunette who was on the Grammys, or the Golden Globes just the other night? The woman with, what's her name? I can't think of it. Anyhow, so the instructive difference here, I think, is between Madonna and Lady Gaga. Lady Gaga is changing her persona with every performance, right? And so she's just streaming novelty. And I think, now, we still get in the face of that fantastic variety, or that streaming change, I think we get some good effects for big brands. And I think it's this kind of, when the world streams with novelty here, you really want to have a connection to big brands, which have this kind of, give you a navigational signal. They give you a kind of anchoring in the world, so whatever else changes, and everything else is going to change.
Which is a great way to segue to vision.
And yes.
Why I'm curious why you've not said vision.
Yeah.
Talked about vision, the importance of setting a direction,
right,
as opposed to saying, following these anthropological trends and saying, well, I kind of see opportunities here, where in our business, you're having to look 3, 5, 7, 8, 10 years out.
Yeah.
I mean, these are big bets, right?
Yeah.
It's not, I can change my product line in a minute, right?
Totally.
So where's the role of vision in this? Saying, maybe I don't fully see the trends. Like, I would actually argue, looking at the orange juice box.
Right.
Okay. Who's to say that wasn't the right direction? Show me the metrics. First of all,
right.
And I come from a design background. I come from an ad agency background. That's why I would say, hey, it's beautiful. It may not have met the needs of a particular target audience.
Right.
That doesn't mean he was wrong.
Well, 20% drop in sales says he's wrong in a month.
And I look at that, but I'd also say that how many examples of things where we show, hey, people got too far out ahead of a curve because their vision was too far out.
Right.
That's what I'm saying, is how do you then blend those things there? Because otherwise you're just always a fast follower, which we get the most discredit for being.
Yeah, totally. I think if you know your culture, you can talk about trajectories. And so you're no longer locked into that brief moment when things we think about this as a kind of ocean plus a surface world, right? And there are forces operating to shape what's happening underwater. And if what we're doing is, if the only time we can track them is when they break the surface and capture them as they arc and then disappear again, as things get faster, that's a mug's game, as my father would have said. What we want is to have some sense of what's circulating under the surface and tracking it and having some sense of what its possibilities are, so that when it breaks the surface, we know it on a first name basis, and we can make some predictions about how long, how fast, well, this is one of the things I didn't talk about, but one of the things I recommend in the book is this notion of a big board. And I have a student who now works in a big now manages a big portfolio fund, is one of the people who does. And I love the way he goes through, looks at all of his stock bets on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis, figures out, well, the things he did right, even the decisions he made right, he goes through and figures out why he was right and whether he was right for the right reasons, and then for the reasons he was wrong, he's just scrupulously kind of honest about the assumptions he made and why his thinking was off. And so if we can pick up things really early and track them, then they should be old friends by the time they hit the mainstream, and we should have some sense of, and I love the way he's effectively having to place bets, right, because he's managing, but we could do that too.
We're placing big bets with everything we do.
Totally.
There's the consumer and then, talk about the commercial side of the business.
Yeah.
They're very different.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, and they're moving at different paces.
Yeah. So I like the idea of us picking up stuff when it's almost all noise and not much signal. It's really hard to tell what it is, right? Some of the innovations that we now see in a Hollywood screen showed up in Alphabet City in New York City 20 years ago as innovative kind of filmmaking. And in those days, you're really not sure what you're looking at. You're not sure if it's good for anything, but you should have it on the big board, and you should be watching it. You should have metrics that say, yeah, it's recruiting, it's growing, it's happening. And then you should say, in 3 months, we figure it should be here. And when it's not there, 3 months later, we have to say, well, we were wrong somehow about what we thought it was going to be. I mean, that's what I'm hoping. Thank you. Well, thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks for listening. Really, please give me a shout.